There are a couple of new features that were added to Vue as of version 7.5, and then an overall change to spectral atmospheres in version 8. So we're first going to take a look at the new features as of version 7.5. And this scene I have loaded in right now, you can load in from the project content directory that comes with the training. So if you want to take a look at this scene, it's a pretty modified default scene, a lot of haze, and an overall soft look to it. If we go over to the Cloud tab, I do have two sets of clouds loaded in already and slightly modified. I'm going to turn on first the thick cumulus layer, which is the lower clouds. And this is a render of just those lower clouds. I do have some custom settings for just rendering fast clouds. It may not be anything great for final output unless the image is scaled down. If you render larger, sometimes it can produce a pretty good result. We'll just take a look at those really quick. What I have is a user setting, and the main thing is turning up the advanced effects quality to 100%. And then the rest of the options just pretty much left the default. And I do want to note that, if you're not familiar, clouds are objects, so they do apply to the object anti-aliasing. If you are using xStream, the rendering is controlled by your host application, and you will have to adjust your anti-aliasing quality based on your primary application, and the Vue anti-alias options do not apply. If you're using standalone, I've just got these really turned down. These are not great settings. Mainly using the soft anti-aliasing strategy really helps the look, but mainly it's just getting a quick render out of it. And then I do have, this is important, under the sky, fog, and haze, the quality boost turned to negative 2.4. I've found that the quality boost is equal or very similar to the advanced effects quality. And the range, if I was to compare, it does change, and it really depends on how much light is in the scene and shining through clouds or the density of the atmosphere. But for the most part, this full slider seems to equal around 2 to 4 of a quality boost. Normally around 2.5, I've found, seems to be about the same. So if I boost up the advanced effects quality to 100%, I can normally reduce the quality boost down to negative 2.5. By default, the new quality boost has been changed to negative 1, which you'll start to see. And that can be a little grainy. For a full no-grain render, and this is primarily for the atmosphere, not the clouds, because the overall look of the clouds is primarily controlled by the object anti-aliasing, but the lighting of the clouds and then the atmosphere itself, any sort of shadows and haze, those are controlled by the quality boost. A setting of 16 to 32 is required to get absolutely no grain whatsoever in every situation. That's typically not doable. It takes a long time to render. And that's really based on circumstance. There are some scenes where you can render with a quality boost of 12 to 16, and it renders pretty quickly. But with clouds, it does take a bit longer because of the lighting. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. I'm going to go over to the Cloud tab and turn on the big cumulus layer. And go ahead and we can take a look at a render with just these two layers. Without any of the new features really on. One of the settings is always on. We'll take a look at that in a sec. And while this is rendering, I do want to make a quick note, and that is the reason I have the advanced effects quality up is because it is an overall quality boost for the lighting in the scene, all volumetrics, and the quality boost mostly applies to just the clouds and the sky, and those levels, higher amounts, take longer to render than increasing the advanced effects quality and getting that similar amount like I was talking about before, where it's around 2.5 in order to produce the same amount of look, reducing the grain. So using the advanced effects quality will render faster than an increased quality boost. So here are both cloud layers rendered. What we don't really see is shadows between the clouds. And with one of the new features, a new way to project those shadows, because it was previously possible, just it took a lot longer to render and didn't always look great. And if we go to the atmosphere editor, and under the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab, we now have the ability to use projected shadows on clouds. Before, you would have to use volumetric sunlight, and that would produce grain and really increase the grain, and it wouldn't always look great. Took a little longer to render. So now we can use a projected shadow map basically on the clouds, and this also applies to objects. We'll take a look at that in just a sec. So it's not just cloud layers. It also applies to geometry being and projecting its shadow onto the cloud. I did turn down my quality boost to negative 3.2 just to speed up that last render, which only took 2 minutes 36 seconds. And let's take a look now with the projected shadows. And I do want to note that I do have my trace quality turned down pretty low, and I am using ray tracing. So we do notice a bit more grain around the edges, and this is also caused by the clouds being more transparent around the edges. So sometimes you can increase the cover amount or adjust the filter to really cut the cloud off there to prevent any little feathers that would grain up the render. So now we have the ability to project these shadows onto cloud layers back and forth, and then have objects too. And I also want to note another way you can remove some of the grain. Now this probably isn't going to be the best for animation, but if you're just working with stills, you can use the lens glare, and that will help soften up the look. The more light that's in the scene, the better that's going to turn out. But it did already remove some of that grain. If you have access to any other sort of post-processing, use the other application, and that way you can preserve the original render. And if you're exporting EXR or any of the other 32-bit formats, then you don't want to have any post-processing on the image whatsoever. You'd want to turn off the natural film response and also lens glare, any post-processing. Exposure, it shouldn't really matter. Now, as of View 7.5, there's also a new light scattering option for just cloud layers. And if we take a look at where the sun is showing up behind the cloud, I'm going to go ahead and select the sun, point it at the camera, which in this case did reset the sun position. So I'll go ahead and just get that back, just so I can grab it really quick and put it where I want it. Switching to the View gizmo with Move. Looks like there's just a few issues. Make sure we just grab the main handles. And I just want to place this kind of around just behind a cloud so we can see the edges. And if we go to the Atmosphere Editor, and in the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab, the three primary diffusion light settings for the entire scene, the glow intensity, and then the scattering options for the overall scene, and then also the clouds. And it's really like a diffusion of the light. The higher the settings are, the less diffused the light is and the more concentrated in one area. When these sliders are set to 1, there's no diffusion whatsoever, and it's all just direct light for the most part. Or at least no scattering. 0 is kind of a consistent amount. But what we can see, even in the preview in the Opengl, is with the cloud setting set to 1, we can see the sun behind the clouds. So we have no scattering of the light, it's just the direct sun right behind it. So we could set it up that way. And then the overall lighting of the scene, as we can see, adjusting the atmosphere, is the other slider that was already part of view. So now around the edges of the clouds and the way we want them to glow, we can adjust this light setting. This is going to be greatly impacted by some of the settings within the cloud itself, being the density and the opacity amounts. And if you really want the edges of the cloud to glow, one of the best things you can do is increase the opacity or density and up the sharpness value. You will need to use the version 2 model, the Spectral version 2, the volumetric layer model, now because Spectral 3 is out, which is really just an overall adjustment to the way the atmosphere is lit, and not necessarily a new cloud type. So Spectral 3 also affects the volumetric layer version 1 layers. And now the only problem I've seen with the new Spectral 3 is because more light shines through clouds now than they did before. You may have to adjust any previous scene loaded in, modifying cloud layers to get rid of any potential grain that can happen from the areas being too dark. And primarily, you will need to adjust the density and opacity amounts. Sharpness still works about the same. The ambient lighting can be important, along with, if we look at the material, the GI ambient lighting, and whether or not we're using the Force ambient light color. And if you need to, what you can do is adjust the volumetric color and make it darker. Now by default, pretty much every cloud is white. What I like to do for stratus or thicker cumulus clouds is turn down this setting and make them a little bit darker. And that lets less light shine through. And mainly, the biggest thing is the more layers you have, and depending on the angle in which the sun is set, the more light that is shining through cloud layers, the longer it takes to process. So if you have really low density settings and a lot of light that's shining through clouds, and you have a sunlight that's set more towards what would be a sunrise, then it has to shine through the layer all the way through the cloud layer, not just going directly down on the top. It's shining through the side, which will take a lot longer to process. So that is really important to keep in mind, because it will severely increase the time it takes to render and process a lot of these effects. Especially if you're using God rays, which at the moment I'm finding to be very grainy, much more so than previous versions. It probably will be updated and modified. But I have seen some issues with the ambient light and the ambient lit areas of cloud layers when God rays is turned on, producing a lot of grain. I also want to note regarding the new projected shadows on cloud feature, if you're looking straight up into the sky like I am right now, and there's no layers above the cloud layer, no objects interacting, you don't need to have the option on unless you have intersecting cloud layers, because it's just going to take extra time to process the shadow when it's not even in the render, and it can take a little bit longer even if the shadow isn't seen. So if you're just looking directly up at one cloud layer, you don't need to have that setting on. So let's just take a look at two examples of the projected shadows involving objects. So what I want to do is just load in a procedural terrain, or create a procedural terrain, and scale it up really large, and I'm just going to bring it into the cloud layer in front of the camera. Just scale that up a bit more, and then go ahead and move the camera above the cloud layer. So we'll go ahead and swap out, we'll just make it a grassy mountain, which is not exactly realistic. That's alright. Just increase the bump depth on this grass material. So we're going to take a look at where the shadows are. And it's really nice having this new Opengl shadow preview really give you a good indication where the light is. And we do have projected shadows on clouds turned on. It may not show in the preview, and I am going to make sure that I do have in my material layers dissolve near objects turned off for the moment, so that it gets as close to the terrain as possible. So we should have a good intersection here. And I can tell that the sun is a little too high in the sky to really see this showing, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel this render. Just go to the atmosphere editor and go to the sun tab and just bring down the pitch, and then we can see that in the preview. So we'll go ahead and look at a full render. So now we can see that the object is projecting its shadow onto the cloud layer, and a lot of grain here, of course, because of my render settings, but this did render in 57 seconds, so I can't really complain about that. It's a good enough idea to give a good preview, and it does render faster and looks better than the preview render in some cases. And really, I could just export this to Photoshop and run a reduced noise over it, sharpen edges, possibly a surface blur, and then it will look perfect. So that's a 57-second render I'd be able to clean up really quickly. So if you need to render out really large frames and higher quality settings are just taking too long, render it out even larger with lower quality settings, scale it down, run some post-process if needed. It tends to work pretty well. I also want to note that the ground plane and infinite terrains do play a role in the projected shadow option. So this is really best seen when the sun itself is slightly under the horizon. Really depending on the scene, I may have my haze setting up a little too far in order to see this. We'll go ahead and do this with a new scene. Going to add in a cloud layer, and we'll use the dark cumulus. I'm going to turn down the density and opacity amounts. We'll take the ground, load in a better material, and move the camera out. Go to the atmosphere, and we can take the sunlight, and I'm going to type in a value of -3, and then go to Sky Fog and Haze and crank up the aerial perspective, which will allow the light to shine through a little better. So it's going to give the illusion that we're higher up. I just want to reduce that to just have a little bit of light showing through. Let's go ahead and take that pitch and use -1. So we're just slightly below the horizon. Increase the cover of the clouds. And we're going to see a big change now when we switch over to the projected shadows. I'm going to use the zoom function and just zoom in so we can see where the clouds are. Reduce the haze density. And right now there's currently no impact of the ground plane and its shadow on the clouds. Even though we're below the ground with the pitch, we're below the horizon. Because of our altitude, the camera itself is able to see the sun, but we need to use the volumetric sunlight or projected shadows in order to impact it. I also want to note that I'm using the low quality render settings again, and overall this doesn't look too bad. It doesn't look all that grainy because of the way the lighting is, and it took under a minute to render, so that's really not too bad. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to projected shadows on clouds, and we can already see in the preview the change. I'm going to go ahead and render this out. So now we can see a huge difference where we have this large shadow fall off compared to the version with the projected shadows turned off. So that's a pretty big impact on the scene. It allows you to do quite a bit more. For planetary scenes, it can be really important. I also want to note that in some cases, you can increase render times by using the projected shadows because less light is shining through the cloud. Once the shadow map's set, no more light needs to be calculated sometimes, and it can go a little faster. That's not always the case, but sometimes. That's really with simple scenes where, in this case, it did render a little bit quicker, but that's mostly because most of the scene is in shadow now. So there's a lot less to calculate. And I'm just going to make this a little more interesting. We might as well finish this up, make it somewhat of a proper scene. I'm going to open up the atmosphere editor, go to the sun, reduce the size, and turn down the corona size, and then go over to Sky Fog and Haze, and the scattering for the sky, turn that up, and that way the light's really going to concentrate around where the sun is rising up. We can do the same with clouds. And then we can reduce glow intensity. And this way we can focus a little more on the rest of the scene. And then if we need to, we can increase the mean altitude of the sky, which is going to give us a little more blue, because we wouldn't see such a harsh cutoff with the clouds straight against the black of the atmosphere. If you get high enough above the troposphere where all the weather is, then you're going to see that darker amount, but you're certainly not going to see any clouds. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render of this. And that looks a little bit better. Not great though. I'm going to make just one or two more adjustments, but we can definitely see that shadow contrast much higher now. I'm going to go ahead and adjust the sun. Let's go ahead and try -3. Really give us that morning light, and then we can adjust our decay amount and kind of play around with the altitude. I'm going to reduce the decay. go ahead and make it slightly more red than yellow, kind of making it orange. Let's take a look at that. So a little more interesting now. Definitely not framed correctly. Probably would be better widescreen. Most things are. But overall, I think that's pretty much it for the new additions and modifications to the spectral clouds and the atmosphere itself. I do want to note that if we go to the material settings and some of the overrides that we have for the material for clouds, like don't receive shadows, some of these may not be working. At the moment, the shadow override is not at all working for this material, or this type of material. So you'll just have to check with future releases and see if that's something that gets modified. That'll allow you to customize things a little bit more. But definitely some nice new enhancements to the application. Although, if needed, you may have to revert back to a previous version in order to keep consistency with some of the cloud layer shapes or some of the look and settings. I have noticed that in 8, clouds do tend to be cut off at some points more than what was happening in View 7. If you're using xStream, you can revert to a different core version.